Hi everybody, this is Tracy and I'm going to be doing my oral presentation on adoption in the United States. So the official definition of adoption according to Merriam-Webster is the action or fact of legally taking another's child and bringing it up as one's own, or the fact of being adopted. The numbers, there's a lot of numbers I can throw at you. These are just the ones that I felt kind of spoke the strongest, I guess. So in the United States, 135,000 children are adopted each year, and currently there are 1.5 million adopted children living in the United States. The average age of children waiting for an adoptive family is 8 years. However, we know, and we'll talk on the next slide, most children who are adopted come through the foster care system. So more than 60% of the children in foster care spend 2 to 5 years before being adopted. And another interesting number that I found is about 2% of Americans have adopted. However, more than a third have considered it. So children are placed up for adoption for a variety of reasons, but really the top 4 are listed here. So the first 3 are typically happen when birth parents are deceased or their whereabouts are unknown. If the birth parent is unwilling to care for the child, or unable to care, and that could be due to mental illness. It could be because they don't feel that they can support them financially. They could be incarcerated or deemed unfit by the court, and that's where that foster care piece comes in. Of non-step parent adoptions, because we do know that sometimes step parents do legally adopt their stepchildren, but of the non-step parent, 59% of adoptions are for foster care, 26 are from other countries, and 15 are voluntary, meaning the parents decide that they are not able to take care of the child and they put them up for adoption. So here's some comparisons with all of the children in the United States and the race compared to the adopted children. So as you can see, 56% are non-Hispanic white. But when you look at the composition of adopted children, 37% are non-Hispanic white. Of all children, non-Hispanic black are 14%, while adopted children, 23% of non-Hispanic black. Hispanic is 20% of all children, 15% of adopted. And then you can see a huge difference here, which at first I found really interesting, but it'll make sense in a second. The non-Hispanic Asian, 4% of all children, but 15% of adopted children, which at first I was like, what the heck? But then I found this information, and this totally explains it. That is primarily from international adoption. So if you look here, this shows you foster care, private domestic, and international. So 3 adoption types. And then you can see the race of each group there. And international, 59% of international adoptions are non-Hispanic Asian, which as soon as I saw that, that made sense to me. With foster care, non-Hispanic white comprise 37%, with non-Hispanic black at 35%, and Hispanic at 16%. Non-Hispanic Asian, I'm going to guess that's around 1 or 2%. And then you can see similar numbers for, different numbers for the private domestic, with 50% being the non-Hispanic white, 25% black, and 13% Hispanic. So when I was doing the history of adoption, it was really overwhelming because there are so many milestones ever since 1851, and there are so many things I can talk about. So what I did was I just pulled out kind of like the top ones, and I wanted to share with you guys kind of why I feel that they are more important when we're looking at the history of adoption. So the first one is 1851, and this was when Massachusetts passed the first modern adoption law, and it recognized adoption as a social and legal operation based on child welfare rather than adult interest. In 1854, the New York Children's Aid Society was developed, and this was related to the orphan trains. So we talked a little bit about orphan trains. Honestly, I can't remember if it was this class or another class, but I do know that we have talked about orphan trains, and so it's connected to that. 1872, the New York State Charity Aid Association was organized. It was one of the first organizations in the country to establish a specialized child placement program. And by 1922, they had homes for more than 3,300 children. 1909 was the first White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children, and it declared that poverty alone should not be grounds for removing children from their family. 1910, the first specialized adoption agencies were founded, and in 1912, which isn't listed on the screen, but Congress created the U.S. Children's Bureau. 1919, the Russell Sage Foundation published the first professional child placement manual, and the U.S. Children's Bureau, set minimum standards for child placing. In 1935, the Social Security Act included provisions for aids to dependent children, crippled children's programs, and child welfare. This eventually led to a dramatic expansion of foster care. 1948, the first recorded transracial adoption of an African American child by white parents took place in Minnesota. 1959, the UN Assembly adopted a Declaration of Rights of the Child, endorsed in 1960 by a Golden Anniversary White House Conference on Children and Youth. Fast forward a little bit to 1970, adoption reached their century-long statistical peak at approximately 175,000 per year. And about 80% of those were arranged by agencies. 10 years later, in 1980, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act began offering funding to states that supported subsidy programs for special need adoptions. And in 1994, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act was the first federal law to concern itself with race and adoption, and it prohibited agencies receiving federal funds from denying transracial adoptions on the sole base of race. So looking at services, I don't know if this is unique to where I'm at. So I'm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I feel like we just have a ton of services here for adoption. So I just kind of picked out the top 4. So Bethany Christian Services, Presley Ridge, and Covey's Family Services are all local nonprofits here in Lancaster County. And they all do more than just adoption. They all also have foster care. They do different types of education. They work with refugees and immigrants. Covey's has a phenomenal family education program. And so they do a lot with the whole family, not just with adoption, but they are kind of the primary places in Lancaster where people will go. And then, of course, we have the Pennsylvania Statewide Adoption and Permanency Network that is for the entire state. National services, again, there are a lot, so I just kind of picked 3. Children's Bureau of Office of the Administration for Children and Family, the Adoption Exchange Association, and National Council for Adoption. So these all have some of the similar things and some things that are different. So they provide resources to families. They will answer questions. All of their websites have information on adoption. Those common FAQs that come up. It'll talk about the different processes. It'll give you statistics for your state, for the nation. But mostly they're really there to support families and children through the adoption process and to advocate for that. So interventions, looking at the micro, macro, and meso level. So I just kind of have some pictures representing what I'm thinking as far as interventions. So the top one there is, in my mind, a social worker working with maybe an adoptive mother. So from the micro, really there's so much that can be done with adoption. So it can start from when a woman finds out she's pregnant and she's contemplating what she wants to do with that pregnancy. The social worker can be there to support and give resources and counsel her through. When she makes her decision, the social worker can be there to support that decision. And if the decision is adoption, then they can help them decide what kind of adoption they want, whether that is, an open adoption where the birth parents, get maybe annual letters and pictures, or Could it be a closed adoption, or is there somebody in the family who might want to take the child? So the social worker would help the adopted or the birth parent through all of that. On the other end, they could be helping parents who wish to adopt. So doing adoption education and getting them prepared and connecting them with available children for them to adopt. And then once the adoption process is over, the social worker can be there again for both sides to help counsel the birth parent, because there's a lot that goes on after somebody gives birth and then gives their child up for adoption, and also to be there for the adoptive parents to get them through that process to finalize everything. So that would be the meso. Next would be really looking at the community. So I found this picture when I was looking for other pictures, and it looked interesting, so I went and I visited their website. And the Donna K. Evans Foundation is a foundation that focuses on the adoption aftercare. So it's really like the sign there says, supporting women after they've placed their child up for adoption. And I don't think, at least in my mind, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but I don't think a lot of people really consider what a birth mother goes through after they give up a child. Even if they're giving up the child for all the right reasons and they know it's the best choice and they're confident in their decision, there's just so much that happens mentally and emotionally afterwards. And so I think on kind of that community level, creating an awareness and a support system, and being able to, have different programs and things out there, not only for these women, but also to make the community aware that this exists and this is happening, and this is something that we need to be supportive of. And then the final is advocacy. There is so much to advocate for adoption. Adoption is really expensive. If you adopt a child through foster care, it is anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. If you do a private adoption, it's triple that. So just really advocating for adoption to be something that is feasible for families. When we look at that statistic of, 1/3 of families have considered it in America, I wonder if that's because, or they decided not to because of the cost and because of everything that goes into it. So really looking at a national level and advocating, what can we be doing to be recruiting more adoptive parents? We have so many children in foster care that could use permanent loving homes. What can we be doing not only to promote that, but also to work with families through the process? So beneficial services. So it's kind of what I mentioned before. I look at that 1/3 of Americans who considered adoption, but why did they not follow through? So of my 3 beneficial services that I've thought of, I really think one of those could be diving into that a little bit deeper, and particularly locally where I'm at. Why are parents, prospective parents, not following through? And what can we be doing to help them? Is it confusion of the process? Is it too time intensive? Is it too much of a financial investment? What could it be? The other 2 things are really supporting birth mothers following adoption. So, I have Birth Mothers Day, so recognizing and honoring those who chose to adopt for their children. I really think that there should be more services to support mothers through that process, and I will be honest, I didn't spend weeks and weeks and weeks researching this, but the research I did do, there are not a lot of programs, at least in my area, that support birth mothers much longer after the adoption process. So I really feel like that's a service that could be brought in. And then realistic education in preparation of the adoptive parents. So I have a journal article on the reference page where they did a study of adoptive parents, and 2 years after they had had their children, they were all domestic adoptions, and all the children were adopted around the age of 2, and they had them for about 2 years. And they looked at, were their expectations realistic between what they thought they were getting into and what actually happened with adoption, specifically around behaviors and things like that. And it turned out that the majority of them did not have realistic expectations. So how can we really educate families and have